Hello and welcome to part 2 of this Grisaille painting tutorial. In this part, what we're going to be working on really is still filling up the canvas. So we can't quite say yet that we've gotten through the entire block-in stage. Now, the reason for this is that in the early stages of a painting, I like to be really deliberate about what my objective is. So I would rather have painted a really well blocked-in head than to have filled up the canvas, yet not had the time to refine the choices that I took initially. So our objectives here really are twofold. We need to go left to right, top to bottom, fill up the canvas by taking good choices and executing those choices at every level, while also furthering and deepening the expression of structure inside the head that we're painting. It's so important that every step we take goes to contributing to a sense of complexity and subtlety in the design of your picture. We never want to be in the place where we're adding something to our painting, yet it's detracting from the quality we're able to express. Of course, that's easier said than done, but I'm going to touch upon some techniques here that I think are going to allow you to open up again that sense of attention that is required for really elevating the design in a portrait. Every time you do something to a painting, you should have a goal about where you want it to go. Otherwise, we spend our time waffling around and don't make the best use of the window of drying time that we have available to us in this oil painting. I've also added a third pre-mixture to the set of mixtures that I have on my palette. This is really just a kind of shortcut so that I don't have to take from my individual pigments every time that I want to make a combination that I'll then apply to my painting. And that is likely a very healthy way to think about what these pre-mixtures are. They are not something we do because we have to avoid using our pure pigments up here. They are really just a shortcut. So what is the goal at this moment? Right now we need to revive the painting. We have here a dried surface that we need to convert into a surface that wants to accept paint and will allow us to make the kinds of transitions across the form that will help us to push the realism a little bit forward. The logical place for this to start, in my estimation, has always been at what is essentially the beginning of the painting as a whole. I'm sure that you remember from the last video this linear block-in that we did right after I had made the transfer from my drawing onto the canvas. This design really is at the foundation of what the design in our entire painting is. Re-establishing that then will simply mean that we go through the painting and retrace our steps. Everywhere that we created a line segment in the very first moment of the painting, we will also do so here, starting a second window of drying time that will allow us to proceed forward in terms of deepening and creating a more complex sense of design in the painting. Another roadblock that it gets you past is really a psychological one. All of us will have a tendency to want to hold on to what our painting was in the last layer. After all, we spent a lot of time making each individual shape and each individual decision, and we tend to be reluctant to let go of that. So this first moment of the painting then is a statement of purpose. We are here to repaint the picture, not to hold on to the past. And until we have completed that second block-in, we won't be ready to proceed in an orderly fashion through the next stage. Pausing for a moment here, we can see what that second block-in will look like. It's important to point out that really we are still using straight line segments when doing this. Looking even at the most complex and subtle of areas, I want to make sure that you understand that straight lines and line segments really are about an assimilated visual language. It's not that we design or we draw them that way, because in fact, nature is represented in that way, but that this is a practice central to the expression of the process we're going through here. At the core of our ethos is that we work from the broad into the specific. Straight lines represent a geometrical breakdown of the complexity that we find in our subject, and in many ways could be considered to hold together throughout the entirety of the time that we spend painting, really all of our observations. I do want to point out technically one or two things that are interesting to know at this moment. We don't have to make the lines in all of our painting out of the same mixture. If you look instead at some of the lighter areas that I have blocked in here, you can see that eventually I have used a slightly lighter mixture to make some of those lines. This is because, in general, light areas like this do not want to be punctuated by the darkest values. If I took lines that were represented from an area like this and transported them into the center of this light area, I would have too polarized a value effect, and that would set me up to make some poor decisions later on when I'm painting the light and the form in that area. So to review, in general, you want your linear block in to take on a fairly dark personality. That being said, when you get to the lightest areas, don't be afraid to take from your lighter and/or mid-tone mixtures. So finally, after about 3 hours of work at our easel, we should have reached a point where all 4 quadrants of our picture have been filled and considered with equal attention to their relationship to the bigger picture. I want to point out here something also that I think is very difficult for students to understand. And it is, how do we actually paint a background in relationship to the figure? Looking at our source material here, we see a darker value on the right-hand side and a lighter value on the left-hand side. However, what I've expressed in my painting here is in fact the opposite of that. This would seem to contradict in a way what I'm looking at in nature. I want to point out though why that's not the case. And it comes back to the entire purpose behind what I'm doing here. This is a portrait of Olivia. She sits in the center. She will be the most detailed and focal area of the picture. And so the decisions and choices that I take, I try to be figure-centric with them. So when I paint the background, what I'm actually looking at is the relationship in between the value of the background on one side and the value of where the subject is contacting the background. In this instance here, we have the darkness of her hair contacting a section of the background which is a little bit lighter in value. When we look at the other side, where her hair is also contacting the background, we see that her hair is a little bit lighter than the darker background that it's contacting. In my interpretation of the passage of light through this picture, I've maintained both of those relationships with respect to how they appear when I compare the values of the subject where they contact the background. If you follow this idea through, what it eventually leads to is a picture that I feel is in some ways a little bit more true to what that in-the-room observation of the model would really look like. Though we are working in this project from a source photograph, concepts like these are very much derived from working with a live model. And part of why this is so effective when working with a live model is that the light on that model tends to change throughout the day, at least when you're working from natural light in the way that I did as a student. So while the actual value of the background would change and shift dramatically, the relationship of the background to the subject tended to remain relatively constant. I do get asked all the time how the artwork that I make from photographs tends to have such a from life kind of feeling, and it's observations and strategies like these that I think bridge that gap. Of course, there's a lot more complex learning behind it, grasping in your mind, for instance, a consistent three-dimensional structure to the model that you can imagine from multiple directions, and other concepts as well, eventually culminate in an ability to work really from any subject matter. Finally, we have taken this painting as far as we can in this moment. You can see the cooler temperatures taking over in the flesh tones, and now the comparison between those cool colors and the warmth of the areas that are painted purely with raw umber are creating a really beautiful effect of color. There is a little bit more structure in the lights, and by structure, remember that we simply mean an illustration of the planes in relationship to a light source, resulting in a very clearly designed sense of form in the painting. Areas of shadow have been doubled down on and darkened in relationship to what they were when we started today, and we've probably pushed the extent of our value range all the way out to its furthest reaches, taking into consideration the darkest darks and the lightest lights. Speaking about those lightest lights in particular, we have created a lot more variation inside this lightest area. I wanted to communicate the sense of form in between where the hair met the forehead. but I had to do so without interrupting in too dramatic a way this lightest area. Take a look at the edges here in relationship, say, to some of the edges around the shadow shapes. In a hierarchy of edges, these ones here remain much softer than their neighbors here and here. This is very important. A hierarchy of edges will take your painting a long way towards feeling like a finished picture. I've also really pushed a lot the texture and opacity of this lightest plane here. By no means is this an effect that I've thought of myself. For hundreds and hundreds of years, artists have been pushing the opacity in their lightest planes. If you ask my opinion about why it started this way, I think it has to do with the semi-transparent nature of lead white. In my career, I've also used titanium white, and if you have experienced using both, then you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. Titanium white is incredibly opaque, especially the way that modern pigment makers tend to grind the pigment size down to something so small before mixing their paints. It makes for a white paint with a very high tinting strength and an incredible degree of opacity. Lead white, on the other hand, needs a lot of substance in order to build up to that same kind of opacity. While it may sound like I'm saying lead paint is a little bit less effective than titanium, in fact, it's exactly the opposite. Real estate-wise, most of my painting does not require that opacity. In fact, in most cases, I would like my white to be overpowered by the darker pigments, making it easier for me to transition from light into shadow, and also to create the kind of resonant dark halftones that are necessary eventually to turning the form. We are about halfway through the painting process at this moment, with 2 layers of the painting essentially being finished. As if this hasn't been challenging enough, in the next stage, we're going to work on resolving the painting. That's going to mean a lot more subtlety and a lot more labor in terms of creating small transitions on tightly turning forms. The important thing for now is that we have set ourselves up to succeed in the next stage. And really, that's something that you can take with you throughout all of your projects, even if you are painting alla prima. What you do in one moment should set you up for success in the next, because the final moment of the painting, when it's being finished, is the goal that should guide all of our decisions previous to it. Your assignment for this moment is to make sure that you do not have inappropriate edges in terms of their hardness or softness, really almost anywhere in your picture. Let's take the mouth, for example. A really common mistake is to take the upper edge of the upper lip and use a really strong, sharp edge to define it. In oil paint, once that edge is dry, it becomes very difficult to soften afterwards. It needs to be totally repainted, and usually done so with very opaque mixtures, which, as I said just a moment earlier, lead white does not necessarily want to afford you the possibility to do. And so think about it always in terms of a hierarchy. There are the sharpest edges, and then there are, of course, the softest edges. In the softest edges, a value change is still taking place. A color change, in fact, is still taking place, but the boundary in between the two is simply different. And in a way, in oil paint or in drawing, this represents an idea that I think is very practical. When we start to make soft edges, the question quickly becomes, how soft and what kind of soft? The answer changes at different stages of the painting or drawing. What we can say for certain all the time, though, is that the edge should be something different than this. So my first thought when creating a soft edge is, let me make it not like this one. Anything after that will just contribute to the subtlety and expression that I'm able to achieve, but my baseline for accomplishing that task is get rid of the sharp edge.